Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlook here. So in our last video in our series on Introduction to International Relations, we introduced the idea of foreign policy as kind of a subset to international relations, more of the applied piece of international relations. So in that last video, we just talked about broadly what is foreign policy. So I wanted to make the next video, this video, about some of the tools that states use for foreign policy, military, diplomatic, intelligence tools. But instead of just giving the examples that the textbook that I use, which is the OpenStax American Government, I wanted to kind of put it in the context of the current U.S. and Iran conflict. I figured that would bring some of these examples to life and show how there's a lot of overlap between economic tools of the state and military tools and diplomatic tools. So it is July 24th, so as we know, the U.S.-Iran conflict is all over the news. Ceasefires broken. We've had the MOU, we've had some diplomacy, but we also know that the fighting has started again. So I think it's a good conflict to try to think through, okay, what tools does the state have? What can the U.S. foreign policy look like, and what power does the U.S. have? So last video we introduced foreign policy. We introduced this idea that states have several instruments at their disposal. Governments can negotiate agreements, as we know. They can impose sanctions, which is something that's in the news a lot. If you pay attention to politics, political science, you are hearing discussions about sanctions. We talked about forming alliances, something else that is in the news quite a bit. Will the NATO alliance survive? How strong is the NATO alliance right now? States, though, can also gather intelligence, communicate with foreign publics directly, and of course, as we're seeing with the U.S.-Iran conflict, use military force. So all that list, like we talked about, is useful, but it can also be misleading. And as we said at the outset, governments rarely select one tool and use it in isolation. They rarely only select military, rarely only select intelligence gathering. Diplomacy itself. Diplomacy often takes place under military pressure. Well, we'll do diplomacy first, but then we might have to move into a more forceful foreign policy. This isn't a surprise to anyone, but when we think about, okay, well, what are the tools of foreign policy, and we look at the tools, we know that they're oftentimes being used in conjunction with one another. Sanctions may be imposed to create leverage and later suspended as part of a negotiated settlement. So diplomacy and sanctions working together. Intelligence supports both military operations and economic restrictions. Alliances will increase state power, but they also introduce new interests, obligations, and of course, constraints. So when we think of the contemporary conflict between the United States and Iran, we have a pretty useful case to look at, because we can see how these instruments of the state are being used. So we know that beginning in February 2026, the United States, in conjunction with Israel, initiated a major military campaign against Iran. Iran responded with missile and drone attacks against American forces, Israel, and other targets within the region, allies of the U.S., and some military bases, U.S. military bases in the region. Even cursory paying attention to the news, you've seen this on the news. When there are American service member casualties, you see it on the news. You may see clips on social media. So this conflict's front and center to many, many Americans. So we've seen conflict around the Strait of Hormuz, which we've seen all over the news, and I've made some videos about how that impacts domestic politics because of price increases. So hard to avoid this conflict. So okay. So when we think of, okay, well, what role has diplomacy played? Diplomacy has continued alongside the fighting. It might not be front and center, and the Iranians or the Trump administration might not come out and say that, oh, we are working through diplomatic channels. But diplomacy is always happening. There's always some communication, even if it's back channel communication, even if it's through a third party, like the New York Times report came out yesterday or this morning that said the U.S. sent a new ceasefire through Iraq. So through personnel in Iraq to deliver to Iran. Diplomacy is always working in the background. And this accumulated in a temporary ceasefire, which had taken effect in April. Additional negotiations did produce a broad agreement in June. We know shortly after that both sides kind of said, well, that's not what we thought the agreement was. But diplomacy has been working. We know that agreement, that MOU, subsequently weakened, and military strikes have reoccurred. But like I said, there's still diplomacy in the background. Behind the scenes, even if it's not face-to-face, there are still those saying, okay, how are we going to bring out a end to this conflict? So we know that the U.S. possesses an extensive military, an extensive economic juggernaut, diplomatic tools, informational power. So it then does, to some people, raise the question of why is it so difficult to convert that power into a stable political outcome that the U.S. wants. So something we brought up last week and connects with this is that objectives can be hard to achieve, and different instruments can help achieve that differently, and strategy. So we talked about strategy. What is the strategy of the administration? What are they trying to achieve? So having this strategy, okay, this is what we want to achieve in the end. How do we get there? Different tools of the state help you get there in a different way. So depending on what that objective is. So a military strike, which we're seeing a lot, the Department of Defense is putting out a lot of videos of military strikes. And then the IRGC puts out videos of attacks. And these military strikes may destroy a weapons facility, but it does not necessarily change the political preferences of the Iranian leaders. So there's a lot of political scientists, policymakers making their rounds on television saying, well, it's going to be hard to achieve our objectives with just military strikes, or it's going to be impossible to achieve our military objectives with just airstrikes. So that is one tool that the U.S. foreign policy has, but it might not achieve the elective objectives alone. So we also see sanctions. Sanctions being used, which may reduce Iranian revenue, which we see sanctions, we're seeing blockades, we're seeing the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, we've seen this for over a month now, trying to really cut down on the money that the Iranian government can possess. We've seen, though, we've seen this in a lot of cases, that sanctions don't necessarily or automatically produce concessions. Autocracies, like Iran is, like Russia is, have abilities to withstand these economic downturns pretty well because the leaders aren't They don't have to win that next election in the same way that a democracy does. High gas prices in the U.S. Instantly putting pressure on those in the White House and those in Congress to find a resolution. In an authoritarian regime, they don't face those same type of constraints. So we see military, we see sanctions, diplomacy. Diplomacy may create a ceasefire, like we saw. It may not resolve the underlying strategic rivalry or concerns. So the U.S. and Iran said they had a ceasefire. Iran interpreted the ceasefire as giving them, after 60 days, the right and privilege to toll the Strait of Hormuz if they want. And it didn't really concretely address the nuclear issue program, which the Trump administration says is the big issue at play here. So diplomacy helped find a solution to the conflict in the short term, but it did not. Both sides weren't even in agreement of what that MOU, what that agreement looked like. So we see that the U.S. government has different tools at play. We can sanction, we can use the military, we can use diplomacy, but it is hard to find your strategic objectives with really any of these. So when we think of what a strategic objective is, what is the administration trying to achieve? What is the long-term goal? So the Trump administration has said it is to have an Iranian regime that does not possess the capacity to generate nuclear weapons. It has included at times, a little bit of democracy building, especially early on in the conflict, because there were demonstrators in the streets that the Trump administration seemed to have thought would help rise up. So the strategic objective, okay, what do we want to achieve? No Iranian nuclear weapons, maybe a little bit of democracy, as well as now the Strait of Hormuz. Well, how do we get there? Well, we can use diplomacy, but we see some of the drawbacks. Even getting agreements on what the document that we both signed means. Disagreements there. Military. Here, another tool of the state. Well, we can use the military to try to defeat an adversary, but what we've seen over the past is this will be very difficult to do with just air power alone. I think it's, let me put my internet. Sorry. Live research here. Yeah, Professor Robert Pape, who I've seen made quite a few. He's made some. He's all over the internet talking about what's going on. Has talked about, and he's written a book. I haven't read it. It's eventually I'll read it just because it looks interesting. About how air power alone will not be able to achieve the U.S. strategic objectives. So then, what does that mean? We've then seen a debate. Okay, well, are ground troops going to be needed? A small incursion into Iran versus a full-scale invasion. And then here's where domestic politics comes in. Is there really going to be an appetite in the U.S. for ground troops in Iran? When we look at polling, the answer is probably no. We know the war doesn't have a lot of support. So maybe then the military toll of the state isn't going to achieve the strategic objective that the administration wants. So diplomacy, economics, we can think about. Okay, well, we can continue to sanction the Iranian government, block the Strait of Hormuz. With Russia, we've seen sanctions put on the regime. We've seen that they can't sell oil above a certain price. These economic tolls of the state meant to try to change the behavior. And so if we open up that toolbox, we look at, okay, the economic weapon. Can that change the adversary's behavior? Maybe. With Iran, though, it seems like Iran is willing to sustain pretty dire economic situations, at least those at the top. And we could have a whole discussion about, okay, when sanctions occur, who really gets hurt? Is it the people at the top, or is it average people? So when we think of U.S. foreign policy, the state has many, many tools at their disposal, usually working together. Well, maybe some military and diplomatic power together with some economic sanctions. But it all goes back to, okay, what is the strategic objective and how we get there? So if we looked at other conflicts, we could think, okay, well, what is the strategic objective for the conflict in Russia? Why does it matter to the US that there's a conflict in Eastern Europe? And so here, just in our introductory lectures, I just wanted students to think that we talked about introduction of foreign policy, and now that the state has lots of different tools, economic tools, military, diplomacy, intelligence, which we'll go into in a different video, all trying to work towards a strategic objectives. Thank you.